Tonight, you are listening to True Crime for Sleep. There is no music here, no sudden changes in tone, no urgency, just a steady voice and a story told slowly, with care, so your thoughts can soften as the night deepens around you. If you are able to, dim the lights where you are. Let the room grow quieter. Allow your body to settle into whatever position feels most comfortable. You do not need to focus closely on every word. You can listen gently, the way you might listen to distant rain or the low hum of night outside a window. The stories shared here are real, but they are told with respect. There are no graphic details, no shock, and no pressure to stay awake. The purpose is not to disturb, but to create a calm space where your mind can slow down and rest. Tonight's story is about absence, about a disappearance that unfolded quietly in the early hours of a cold winter morning, in a place where nothing like this was expected to happen. There was no struggle witnessed, no loud event that broke the night, just a child who stepped away from home and was never seen again. This is the disappearance of Asha Degree. Asha was 9 years old when she vanished in February of the year 2000. She lived with her family in a small North Carolina community, in a home defined by routine, care, and familiarity. What makes this case especially haunting is not only that Asha was so young, but that her disappearance appears to have involved deliberate movement rather than chaos. She did not vanish in a crowd. She did not disappear during the day. She left during the night, alone, in poor weather, in circumstances that still feel difficult to understand. Because this is a sleep-focused documentary, we will move slowly and carefully. We will focus on what is confirmed, and where uncertainty exists, it will be named clearly. There will be no speculation presented as fact, and no attempt to force meaning where evidence does not exist. This case has remained open for many years. Over time, it has become part of collective memory, not because it offers answers, but because it resists them. It asks quiet questions about childhood, safety, and trust, about how well we truly understand the routines that feel so secure. As you listen, you do not need to search for explanations. You do not need to solve anything. This story does not ask for conclusions. It only asks to be told gently, and then allowed to rest. Take a slow breath in, and let it out. Feel the way the night supports this moment. The day has ended. The outside world has softened. There is nowhere you need to go, and nothing you need to do. You can allow the details to drift past you without holding on to them. This is a story best listened to quietly. A story that unfolds not through action, but through stillness, through time passing, through a single absence that never filled itself back in. As the night continues, we begin at the beginning, in a small town, on an ordinary evening, before anyone knew that something had already started to change. Shelby, North Carolina, is the kind of place where days tend to resemble one another. It is a small city, surrounded by rural roads and quiet neighborhoods, where people often recognize familiar faces at grocery stores, schools, and local churches. Life there has long been shaped by routine, family, and a sense of community that feels steady and predictable. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Shelby moved at an unhurried pace. Nights were generally calm. Streets emptied early. Houses settled into silence as families followed familiar evening rhythms. In places like this, the absence of noise is not unsettling. It is comforting. It signals safety, normalcy, and rest. Families in Shelby tended to live close to one another, both physically and socially. Parents knew the routes their children walked. Schools followed clear schedules. Neighbors looked out for small changes, because in a quiet place, small changes stand out. When something feels unusual, it is often noticed quickly. That sense of safety shaped expectations. People believed that danger came from far away, not from within the familiar boundaries of their town. Children played outside. Families trusted routines. Nights were not something to fear. The neighborhoods were modest and close-knit. Houses were not isolated, but clustered along residential streets where sounds carried easily. A car passing late at night would be noticed. Footsteps would echo more clearly than in a large city. Silence itself became a kind of presence. This is important to understand, because it frames how unthinkable a disappearance felt in a place like this. Shelby was not known for violent crime. It was not a transient area with heavy traffic of strangers. It was a community where people expected children to be safe in their own beds at night. Weather, too, shaped daily life. Winters could be cold and damp, with rain that settled into the ground and air alike. When storms came through, people stayed indoors. Roads grew quiet. The outside world felt distant, almost sealed off, while homes became places of warmth and shelter. In February of the year 2000, that feeling of shelter mattered. Nighttime was not a period of activity. It was a time for rest. Most families were asleep long before midnight. The town itself seemed to pause, waiting for morning. This quiet environment created assumptions that if something were wrong, someone would hear it. That if a child were in danger, there would be noise, movement, disruption. That absence would announce itself. But sometimes, absence does not arrive loudly. Sometimes, it slips quietly into the night, unnoticed, blending into the stillness that usually feels so safe. Shelby was not a place people associated with mystery or fear. It was associated with familiarity, with routine, with the belief that ordinary nights end in ordinary mornings, and that belief shaped everything that followed. Because when the morning came and something was missing, it did not feel real at first. It felt impossible, as though the town itself had made a mistake. The quiet community that had always offered reassurance now held a question it was not prepared to answer. How could something so fragile disappear without being seen? And how could it happen here? Asha Degree was 9 years old in February of the year 2000. She lived with her parents and older brother in Shelby, North Carolina, in a household shaped by structure, care, and routine. By all accounts, it was a stable home. School nights followed predictable patterns. Mornings began early. Evenings ended quietly. Asha was known as a gentle and thoughtful child. She was described as polite, well-mannered, and respectful of rules. She did not seek attention, and she did not cause concern. Teachers remembered her as a good student, someone who listened carefully and tried to do what was expected of her. At school, Asha was dependable. She attended regularly, completed her work, and followed instructions. She was not known for defiance or impulsive behavior. Nothing in her school life suggested distress or rebellion. To the adults around her, she appeared grounded and secure. At home, Asha was closely connected to her family. Her parents were involved in her daily life, and her routine was consistent. There were expectations, boundaries, and structure. This was not a household where children came and went freely without notice. Independence existed, but within limits appropriate for her age. Asha also shared a strong bond with her brother. They spent time together, shared experiences, and moved through childhood side by side. That sibling relationship added another layer of familiarity and comfort to her world. She was not navigating life alone. Those who knew Asha often described her as cautious. She was not fearless. She was not adventurous in a reckless way. She was known to be afraid of the dark and uneasy about storms. These details matter because they stand in contrast to the circumstances of her disappearance. Asha followed rules because she believed in them. She trusted the adults around her. She trusted structure. This trust shaped how people understood her behavior. When someone like Asha does something unexpected, it raises deeper questions. because it does not align with what is known of their personality. She enjoyed ordinary childhood activities: school, family time, small joys that did not attract attention. There was nothing extreme or secretive in her interests, nothing that suggested a desire to escape her life or abandon her. This ordinariness is part of what makes her story so difficult to understand. When a child who struggles openly disappears, people look for causes in visible pain. But when a child who seems content vanishes, the absence feels sharper because it defies explanation. Asha was also young enough that her world was still small. She did not have the independence of a teenager. She did not move freely between distant places. Her life was centered around home, school, and family. That limited range makes her disappearance even more unsettling. It is important to say this clearly. There was no indication that Asha wanted to leave her family behind. There was no record of conflict that would suggest she was trying to run away. There was no pattern of secrecy that pointed toward hidden plans. She was a child, living a child's life, within boundaries designed to keep her safe. When someone like Asha disappears, the mind searches desperately for meaning. People look for the moment where something must have changed. A conversation, a feeling, a signal that was missed. But in this case, much of what remains is normal. A loving family, a quiet child, a structured life. And that normality does not explain what happened. It only deepens the silence left behind. Because when the person who disappears does not fit the story we expect, the questions feel heavier, and the absence feels harder to place. Asha Degree was not defined by mystery before she vanished. She was defined by routine, family, and care. And it is from that ordinary, grounded life that she quietly disappeared. The evening of February 13th, 2000, unfolded without urgency. It was a Sunday night, and the Degree household followed its familiar rhythm. Dinner was eaten at home. Conversations were ordinary. Nothing about the evening stood out as unusual or concerning to the people living it. The weather outside was unsettled. A winter storm had moved through the area, bringing rain and strong wind, the kind of weather that encourages people to stay indoors, to close curtains earlier than usual, and to settle in for the night. In Shelby, storms like this were not rare, but they were enough to make the darkness feel heavier once night arrived. Inside the house, the atmosphere was calm. Asha and her brother spent the evening at home with their parents. There were no arguments reported, no emotional moments, no changes in routine that would later feel significant. It was the kind of night that blends into memory because it feels the same as so many others. At some point in the evening, there was a power outage caused by the storm. The lights went out briefly, a disruption that was inconvenient but not frightening. The power returned, and life resumed as normal. This detail would later stand out, not because it caused alarm, but because it anchored the night in reality. It was a reminder that the weather outside was active, while life inside remained steady. As bedtime approached, the household prepared for sleep. School was scheduled for the next day. Clothes were ready. Alarms were set. These small preparations matter because they suggest expectation. Nothing about the night suggested plans to leave or break routine. Asha went to bed sharing a room with her brother. This was normal for them. It was part of the comfort and safety of their home. She was not isolated. She was not alone. The house settled into quiet as everyone drifted toward sleep. Those who knew Asha understood that she was not comfortable with darkness or storms. She was known to be cautious, even fearful at times. The combination of nighttime, rain, and wind would not have been inviting to her. It would have been something to endure from the safety of indoors, not something to walk into willingly. That contrast is one of the reasons this night has been examined so closely. There was nothing in Asha's known personality that aligned easily with what would later be discovered. The conditions outside did not match her comfort level. The time did not match her routine. The house itself offered no signs of preparation. No packed bag was noticed that evening. No unusual behavior raised concern. Everything suggested that the family expected the night to end as it always did, with everyone asleep under the same roof. As the storm continued outside, the Degree home grew quiet. The sounds of wind and rain became background noise, the kind of noise that fades as sleep takes over. Inside, there was safety, warmth, and familiarity. Nothing about the night before felt like a beginning. It felt like an ending to a normal day. That is what makes it so difficult to sit with, because when people later look back, searching for the moment when something changed, this evening does not offer one. There is no clear break in the pattern, no signal that the night would lead anywhere else. The storm passed through Shelby. The lights stayed on, and the family slept. And somewhere between night and morning, something shifted quietly, without sound. A night that should have ended in rest instead became the last ordinary moment before everything changed. Sometime in the early hours of February 14th, 2000, while the rest of the household slept, the night changed in a way that no one noticed at the time. The storm that had moved through Shelby earlier had not fully passed. Rain continued to fall, and the wind still moved through the area, brushing against houses and trees in the darkness. Inside the Degree home, everything appeared quiet. There were no sounds of disturbance, no raised voices, no sudden movement that woke the family. From the outside, nothing suggested that anything was wrong. The house remained still, wrapped in the ordinary silence of early morning. At some point during the night, Asha left her bedroom. This is one of the most difficult details to sit with, because it is known through what was later discovered, not through direct observation. No one saw her leave. No one heard the door open. No one realized she was gone until morning came. Asha dressed herself carefully. She did not leave in haste. She wore clothes appropriate for the time of year and took personal items with her. This detail matters, because it suggests intention rather than confusion. Whatever prompted her movement, it was not a moment of panic. She exited the house quietly, stepping into the dark and rainy night. The road outside was empty. The town was asleep. The world beyond the front door would have felt very different from the safety of her home. Cold air, wet pavement, limited visibility. These are not conditions most 9-year-old children would willingly choose. And yet, she walked. The distance between the house and the highway was not large, but in the dark, it would have felt longer, especially for a child. Each step would have carried her farther from the familiar and deeper into uncertainty. Still, there is no evidence that she hesitated or turned back. Witnesses would later report seeing a young girl matching Asha's description, walking along the road in the early morning hours. These sightings occurred while it was still dark, before sunrise, during a time when few people were awake or traveling. What stands out in these accounts is consistency. The reports described a small figure moving alone, wearing a backpack, walking with purpose rather than fear. One driver reportedly turned around out of concern, but the child ran off the road and into the darkness. This reaction suggests awareness, not confusion, but choice. Asha appeared to want to avoid contact, even when help may have been available. That detail has stayed with investigators and listeners alike, because it complicates simple explanations. There was no sign of struggle, no indication that she was being followed at that moment. The road itself offered no answers, only direction, forward. The rain continued. Cars passed occasionally. The darkness held. At some point after those sightings, the trail went quiet again. There were no more confirmed observations, no sounds, no movement that could be tracked further. The early morning hours ended the way they often do, with daylight approaching slowly, almost gently, unaware of what had already changed. By the time the house began to wake, the night had already taken something with it. The absence was not discovered immediately. Morning routines began as they usually did. Parents moved through familiar motions, expecting the day to unfold normally. It took time for the realization to surface, and when it did, it arrived softly at first. Asha was not where she was supposed to be. What had happened in the early morning hours did not announce itself with noise or urgency. It left no clear mark on the house, no visible trace that something extraordinary had taken place. Only the quiet truth that a child had walked out into the night and did not come back. In the hours before sunrise, while most of Shelby was still asleep, a small number of people were already awake and moving along the roads outside town. These were early commuters, drivers traveling familiar routes in low visibility, focused more on the road ahead than on anything unusual at the roadside. Later, several of these drivers would report seeing a young figure walking along the highway. The road in question was a stretch of rural roadway bordered by trees and open land, not a place where children were expected to be alone in the dark, especially in bad weather. What drew attention was not panic or distress, but presence. A child-sized figure moving steadily forward, carrying a backpack, walking along the edge of the road as rain continued to fall. At first, some drivers thought they were mistaken. Fatigue can distort perception in the early morning hours. But as the reports accumulated, a clearer picture began to form. One driver slowed down, uncertain of what he was seeing. Another turned his vehicle around, concerned that a child was walking alone in those conditions. When he approached, the figure reportedly moved away from the road and disappeared into the darkness off to the side. That reaction mattered. It suggested awareness, not confusion, not freezing in fear, but a deliberate choice to avoid contact. For investigators, this detail complicated simple explanations. A frightened child might run toward help. A lost child might stop. This child moved away. The sightings were reported independently, which gave them weight. These were not stories passed between witnesses. They were separate observations that aligned in time, location, and description. The consistency did not provide answers, but it established that Asha was likely alive and moving on her own during those early hours. The weather conditions made the situation more unsettling. Rain reduced visibility. Wind masked sound. Darkness limited depth perception. Under those conditions, it would have been easy to miss a small figure entirely. That anyone noticed at all was due to chance. Highways at that hour are quiet but not empty. Vehicles pass occasionally, headlights cutting through the darkness for a few seconds at a time. In those brief moments, something out of place can appear and vanish again before the mind fully processes it. The fact that Asha was seen multiple times suggests she remained on or near the roadway for some distance. She did not immediately leave the area. She continued forward, step by step, into an environment that offered no shelter and no clear destination. There was no report of her getting into a vehicle, no confirmed sighting of her being approached successfully. The road offered movement, but not resolution. At some point, the sighting stopped, not because the night ended, but because whatever path Asha was following moved out of view. The darkness closed back in. The rain continued. The road returned to being just a road. These witness accounts became some of the most important pieces of the case. They confirmed that Asha left the safety of her home and was alive hours later. They placed her in the open, alone, and moving with intention. But they also marked the edge of certainty. Beyond those moments of passing headlights and brief recognition, nothing else could be confirmed. No footprints were traced far enough to matter. No additional witnesses emerged. The landscape swallowed the trail quietly. For those who later learned about the case, these sightings often feel like the most haunting part. A child walking alone through darkness and rain, seen but not reached, present but unreachable. The road did not explain why she was there. It only showed that she was. And then, just as quietly as she appeared, she was gone again. leaving behind only fragments of memory and the sound of rain on pavement, fading into morning. Morning arrived slowly in the Degree household. The storm had eased, and the sounds of night gave way to the quieter rhythm of early day. Inside the house, routines began to stir, still unaware that something fundamental had changed. It was when Asha did not wake for school that concern began to surface. At first, it may have seemed like a small delay. Children sleep deeply. Alarms are missed. Names are called down hallways more than once. These moments are familiar to parents, and they rarely signal danger on their own. But as the minutes passed, the absence became harder to explain. Asha was not in her bed. She was not elsewhere in the house. Her backpack was missing. Shoes that should have been by the door were gone. The house, which had felt secure just hours earlier, suddenly felt incomplete. Panic does not always arrive immediately. Often, it is preceded by disbelief. Parents check rooms again. They search places they have already looked. They hope they have simply overlooked something obvious. When that hope dissolves, fear takes its place. Asha was reported missing that morning. Law enforcement responded quickly, recognizing the seriousness of a child missing under such circumstances. This was not a situation where a child might have wandered off to a friend's house or stayed out late without notice. The timing, the weather, and Asha's age made the situation urgent. Officers arrived at the home and began gathering information. They asked about Asha's routine, her personality, her fears, her habits. They examined the house for any sign of disturbance. There was no evidence of forced entry. No indication of a struggle. The home itself offered no explanation. Attention turned outward. Roads near the house were searched. Neighbors were questioned. Anyone who might have seen something unusual during the night was encouraged to speak up. Time mattered, and everyone involved understood that the first hours were critical. Search efforts began quickly. Law enforcement coordinated with volunteers, expanding outward from the home and along nearby roads. Ditches, wooded areas, and fields were checked. The landscape was difficult, wet from rain and uneven, but the search continued steadily. The community responded with concern and urgency. Shelby was not accustomed to something like this. People who had gone to bed in a quiet town woke up to the realization that a child was missing. Volunteers arrived to help search. Neighbors offered support. Familiar places were suddenly viewed through a different lens. As information came in, the witness sightings along the highway were reported to authorities. These accounts shifted the focus of the search. What had begun as a local search near the home expanded along the route where Asha had been seen walking. Law enforcement adjusted quickly, understanding that this new information suggested movement rather than confinement. The search area widened. Resources were redirected. The effort became larger, more complex, and more urgent. Despite the speed of the response, there were limits. Rain had washed away potential footprints. Darkness had concealed details. Time had passed before anyone knew to look. These factors made the search more difficult, even as it intensified. Throughout this period, Asha's family remained at the center of everything. They answered questions repeatedly. They relived the last normal hours over and over again. They waited for news that did not arrive. The immediate response was swift and serious, but it unfolded within the reality of uncertainty. There was no clear direction to follow, only fragments of information pointing outward into the dark. By the end of that first day, Asha had not been found. The house remained quiet, the road remained empty, and the search, though active, was already chasing time that could not be recovered. The search for Asha expanded quickly, moving beyond the immediate surroundings of her home and stretching outward into the wider landscape. Roads that had once felt familiar were now examined carefully, not as everyday routes, but as places where something important might have passed unnoticed. law enforcement organized systematic searches along the highway where Asha had been seen. Volunteers lined up shoulder to shoulder, moving slowly through ditches and grassy edges, watching the ground with focused attention. Every small item was treated as potentially meaningful. A piece of fabric, a footprint, something out of place in the quiet order of the roadside. The rain from the night before made the work harder. Water had soaked the ground, flattened grass, and blurred any marks that might have been left behind. Mud clung to shoes. Visibility was limited. The earth itself seemed unwilling to give up answers easily. Beyond the roads, wooded areas were searched carefully. These were not dense forests, but stretches of trees and brush that bordered fields and neighborhoods. Places where a child could step out of sight within moments. Places that felt ordinary before, but now carried weight. Search teams moved slowly, guided by caution rather than speed. They listened as much as they looked. Silence can reveal things that noise hides. A snapped branch, a piece of plastic caught in leaves. The smallest sound could draw attention. The community became deeply involved. People who had never taken part in a search before offered their time. They walked in the cold. They stood in the rain. They followed instructions carefully, understanding that one careless step could disturb something important. This collective effort was driven by a shared disbelief. Shelby was not a place where children disappeared into the night. The idea felt wrong, and that sense of wrongness fueled determination. People searched not only with their eyes, but with hope. As the hours turned into days, the scale of the search grew. Law enforcement coordinated resources. Dogs were brought in to track scent where possible. Air support was used to scan wider areas. Each method was employed with care, adjusted as new information emerged. Despite these efforts, the landscape remained quiet. No clear trail appeared. No sign pointed definitively in one direction. The roads stretched on. The woods remained still. The searchers returned each day with less certainty than they had started with. This lack of immediate discovery does not mean the search was unsuccessful. It means that the situation was complex. Children are small. Evidence can be fragile. Time and weather work against clarity. For the family, the search period was suspended between exhaustion and hope. Every passing hour carried the possibility of news. Every returning group of searchers brought anticipation, followed by quiet disappointment. The waiting itself became a form of endurance. As days passed, the community effort did not fade. People continued to show up. They continued to walk familiar paths with unfamiliar purpose. They continued to believe that finding Asha was possible, even when evidence was scarce. The search of roads and woods revealed something important, even without answers. It showed how deeply connected the community was, how quickly ordinary lives could align around a shared goal, how care and concern could spread through a town without hesitation. But the landscape did not yield what everyone hoped for. The roads eventually returned to traffic. The woods returned to stillness. And the search moved into a longer, quieter phase, where effort continued, but certainty remained out of reach. What was left behind was not only absence, but a collective memory of people walking together through rain-soaked ground, believing that somewhere, something would appear and bring the waiting to an end. In the weeks after Asha disappeared, attention began to focus on objects rather than movement. When a person vanishes without explanation, belongings can sometimes speak in ways people cannot. Small items take on weight, not because they answer questions, but because they suggest direction. Not far from where Asha had been seen walking, searchers found items that were later confirmed to belong to her. Among them were pieces of clothing. They were discovered along the roadside, separated from one another rather than gathered together. This detail mattered because it suggested motion rather than a single moment. The placement of these items did not clearly indicate violence. There were no confirmed signs of a struggle at the locations where they were found. Instead, the items appeared to have been dropped or discarded as Sasha continued forward. Whether this was intentional or accidental could not be determined. For investigators, this created a difficult balance. Clothing found along a road can suggest many things. It can point to disorientation. It can point to an attempt to lighten a load. It can point to fear, or it can mean something entirely different. Without context, objects refuse to explain themselves. Later, another discovery added complexity to the case. A backpack, confirmed to belong to Asha, was found buried along a different stretch of land, miles away from where she had last been seen. The backpack was wrapped in plastic, protected from the elements in a way that suggested deliberate placement. This discovery changed the tone of the investigation. A backpack does not bury itself. Plastic wrapping does not happen by chance. These details introduced the possibility of another person's involvement, without confirming it outright. They also widened the gap between what could be proven and what could only be inferred. Inside the backpack were personal items. Some were familiar, some were unexpected. None provided a clear explanation for why Asha left home or where she was ultimately going. Instead, they deepened the sense that the journey had been interrupted in a way no one could see. The distance between the original sightings and the location where the backpack was found raised more questions. It suggested movement beyond what had already been known. It also suggested that time had passed between Asha leaving the highway and the backpack being placed where it was eventually discovered. Investigators examined the items carefully. They documented everything. They tested what could be tested. They avoided overstating conclusions. What mattered most was not speculation, but preservation. Evidence, once misinterpreted, cannot be returned to neutrality. For the family, these discoveries were painful in a particular way. Finding belongings offers a strange mixture of hope and fear. Hope, because it confirms that the person existed beyond the last sighting. Fear, because it suggests separation. Objects remain when people are gone, and that contrast can be unbearable. The items did not confirm harm, but they also did not confirm safety. They existed in the space between, where certainty refuses to settle. They became symbols not of answers, but of distance. As time passed, these belongings became some of the last physical connections to Asha's movement after she left home. They marked points on a map where something real had occurred, even if no one could explain what that something was. Investigators were careful not to assign meaning beyond what could be supported. They did not claim the items proved a crime. They did not claim they proved a plan. They acknowledged only what could be said with confidence. The items belonged to Asha. They were found away from home. They suggested that her journey continued beyond the early morning hours. Beyond that, they remained silent. In many cases, evidence brings clarity. In this one, it brought gravity. It showed that Asha's disappearance was not contained to a single moment or place. It stretched outward, quietly, leaving behind fragments instead of answers. And those fragments, carefully preserved, became part of a story still waiting to be understood. As weeks turned into months, the investigation settled into a longer, quieter rhythm. The urgency of the first days gave way to persistence, the kind that continues without headlines or visible momentum. This was no longer a search defined by immediate movement, but one shaped by patience and careful review. Law enforcement revisited every confirmed detail repeatedly. The timeline was reconstructed again and again, not because it changed, but because sometimes meaning emerges only after familiarity. Each action was examined in relation to the next. Each gap was measured, not filled. Information was preserved rather than exhausted. Tips were logged. Evidence was catalogued. Maps were redrawn. Investigators understood that time could work in more than one direction. It could erase traces, but it could also loosen memories. Someone who felt unsure in the beginning might grow more confident later. Someone who stayed silent might eventually speak. The case remained open, and that mattered. It meant Asha was not treated as a story of the past, but as a person who could still be found. Her name continued to circulate within law enforcement systems. Her image remained current. The file was never closed and placed away. Over time, advances in investigative methods allowed older evidence to be reviewed with fresh perspective. What once seemed unremarkable could later be reconsidered. Investigators returned to physical items, witness statements, and geographic details, asking the same questions with slightly different tools. Public interest rose and fell in waves. Periodically, the case would return to public conversation through anniversaries, renewed appeals, or new lines of inquiry. Each return brought attention, and with it, the possibility that someone might recognize something they had overlooked before. Families living through long-term missing person cases often experience time differently. For investigators, the work becomes procedural and methodical. For families, each year marks another unanswered question. The passage of time does not dull the absence, it reshapes it. Throughout the years, law enforcement remained careful in its communication. Updates were measured. Statements avoided speculation. This restraint was intentional. It protected the integrity of the case and prevented misinformation from becoming embedded in public understanding. The investigation also extended beyond local boundaries. Leads were evaluated across state lines. Comparisons were made cautiously, always grounded in evidence rather than assumption. Investigators understood the danger of forcing connections where none could be proven. As technology improved, so did the ability to store, revisit, and cross-reference information. Data that once existed in isolation could later be examined alongside new material. This did not guarantee answers, but it kept the case alive in practical terms, not just symbolic ones. One of the most difficult aspects of long-term investigations is accepting that progress does not always look like movement. Sometimes, progress is simply staying ready, staying open, staying careful. In Asha's case, there were periods of silence, long ones. Periods where nothing new emerged and nothing could be confirmed. These stretches are often invisible to the public, but they are part of the reality of unresolved cases. Behind the scenes, work continued quietly. Files were reviewed, contacts were maintained, possibilities were held without being declared. The investigation over time became less about chasing answers and more about guarding space for them to appear. It was an acknowledgement that truth does not always arrive on a schedule, and that patience can be a form of commitment. Years passed, but the case did not age out of relevance. It remained present, not because it had changed, but because it had not. And in that steady persistence, the investigation continued to exist, waiting for the moment when something, however small, might finally tip the balance between absence and understanding. As the years passed without resolution, different explanations were considered carefully, always measured against what could actually be confirmed. In cases like this, theories often grow not because evidence demands them, but because uncertainty invites interpretation. The challenge for investigators was to acknowledge possibilities without allowing them to harden into assumed truth. One possibility examined was that Asha left home of her own accord. This idea was approached with caution, because it did not align easily with what was known about her age, her personality, or the conditions of that night. She was 9 years old. She was cautious by nature. She was afraid of the dark and uneasy in storms. These traits made the idea of a voluntary nighttime departure difficult to reconcile. Still, investigators could not dismiss the fact that she was seen walking along the highway alone. That movement suggested agency, even if the reason behind it remained unclear. Police did not describe this as running away in a traditional sense. Instead, They treated it as an unexplained decision that may not have been fully understood by the child herself. Another possibility considered was outside involvement. The discovery of Asha's backpack, buried and wrapped in plastic, far from her home, introduced questions that could not be ignored. Objects do not relocate themselves in that manner. This detail suggested that another person may have been involved at some point after Asha left the roadway. However, the absence of direct evidence limited what could be said publicly. There was no confirmed suspect. No vehicle description tied conclusively to her disappearance. No witness who could place her with another individual beyond doubt. Without those elements, investigators resisted drawing conclusions. Law enforcement was careful to clarify what had not been established. There was no proof that Asha had planned to meet someone. There was no verified evidence of online contact or grooming. There was no confirmed crime scene. These distinctions mattered because speculation, once repeated often enough, can distort understanding. Over time, public discussion expanded far beyond what police endorsed. Some theories grew from misinterpretation of details. Others were shaped by fear or by the desire to impose order on an unresolved story. While public interest kept the case visible, it also created narratives that were not supported by facts. Official statements remained restrained. Investigators consistently emphasized that the case was open, that information was still being reviewed, and that conclusions had not been reached. They avoided ranking theories or suggesting likelihoods, because doing so could narrow focus prematurely. This approach sometimes frustrated observers who wanted clearer answers, but restraint is a form of responsibility. Declaring certainty without evidence can close doors that need to remain open. It can discourage witnesses who do not see their experience reflected in official narratives. What law enforcement returned to again and again was evidence. Confirmed sightings, verified discoveries, documented timelines. Everything else was treated as possibility, not conclusion. The official position did not promise answers. It promised diligence. It acknowledged that Asha's disappearance did not fit neatly into familiar categories. It did not resemble a simple accident. It did not resemble a typical runaway case. It did not offer the markers investigators often rely on to guide resolution. Instead, it existed in a quieter space, where questions outnumbered facts. And so the case remained open, not because it lacked importance, but because it demanded honesty. Honesty about what was known, honesty about what was not, and honesty about the limits of interpretation when evidence refuses to complete the story. In that honesty, the investigation continued, careful not to replace absence with assumption, and committed to waiting for truth rather than inventing it. For Asha's family, time did not move in a straight line after she disappeared. Days continued, calendars turned, seasons came and went, but everything was measured against a single absence that never softened. Life carried on around them, yet something essential remained unresolved, quietly present in every moment. When a child goes missing, families often describe a different kind of waiting. It is not passive. It is alert, persistent, and emotionally exhausting. Hope does not arrive as a feeling of optimism. It arrives as endurance. The ability to keep going without answers, without clarity, and without an ending. Asha's parents continued to speak about her as someone who mattered in the present, not only as a memory of the past. This choice was not denial. It was a way of honoring the reality that without confirmation, certainty does not exist. In that space, hope becomes a form of love rather than expectation. Public attention over the years brought both comfort and strain. Awareness meant the case was not forgotten. It meant her name was spoken, her face remembered, her story carried forward. But it also meant living with ongoing reminders, questions, and speculation from people far removed from the daily reality of waiting. Time changes the shape of grief. It does not remove it. It reshapes it into something quieter, something that must coexist with ordinary life. Birthdays pass, holidays arrive, small moments occur that invite reflection on what might have been. Families in this position often speak of living between two worlds, one where life must continue, and one where everything remains paused. This dual existence becomes normal, even though it should never have to be. For Asha's family, the passage of years did not diminish the importance of answers. If anything, it reinforced it. Knowing what happened matters, not because it can undo the past, but because truth has weight. It offers dignity, it offers understanding, it offers the possibility of rest. Law enforcement continued to treat the case as open, and that mattered deeply. It meant the disappearance was not relegated to history. It meant that new information, no matter how small, would still be welcomed and examined. Hope in long-term cases does not look like confidence. It looks like patience. It looks like keeping space open for truth to arrive when it is ready. It looks like trusting that even after years, someone might remember something differently. Someone might speak. Something might connect. Asha Degree was 9 years old when she vanished. But she did not remain 9 in the minds of those who love her. She grew older in imagination, year by year, as time continued forward without her. That imagined future is part of the loss, but it is also part of the love. Enduring hope is not loud. It does not demand resolution. It simply refuses to close the door, and so the door remains open, quietly, patiently, waiting for the truth to find its way back. As the night settles more fully now, it is okay to let this story ease away from you. You do not need to carry the unanswered questions any further tonight. They can remain here, resting quietly, without asking anything more of your attention. Stories like this do not resolve in the way we expect stories to resolve. They do not arrive at a clear ending or offer a sense of completion. Instead, they soften into something quieter, where understanding is replaced by acceptance, and the mind is allowed to stop searching. If you are lying down, let your body sink a little deeper into the surface beneath you. Feel the weight of yourself being supported. There is no effort required now. Your breathing can slow naturally, without direction or control. Take a gentle breath in, and let it fall away. The world outside your room continues, but it does not need you right now. Streets are quieter, lights are dimmer. The pace of everything has slowed. The night holds things in a way the day never does. If thoughts rise, let them pass without engagement. You do not need to follow them. You do not need to answer them. They can drift by like distant headlights on a road you are no longer traveling. There is a particular stillness that belongs to late hours. It is a stillness that understands that not every question finds its answer, and that rest does not depend on resolution. It allows stories to exist without demanding conclusions. Asha's story does not ask you to stay awake with it. It does not ask for vigilance or worry. It simply asks for gentleness, and that gentleness can now turn inward, toward yourself. Let the sound of my voice become less important now. Let it blend into the quiet around you. It does not need to be followed closely. It can simply exist, steady and distant, like the night itself. There is no need to rush toward sleep. There is no expectation to reach it quickly. Sleep arrives best when it is not summoned, but allowed. Your body knows how to rest. Your mind knows how to loosen when it is safe to do so. And in this moment, it is safe to let go. Thank you for spending this quiet time here, and for listening with care and patience. These stories are told slowly, without music, without urgency, and without judgment, so the night can remain calm. For now, let everything grow still. Let the room fade. Let the thoughts slow. And allow sleep to arrive in its own time, gently and quietly. Good night.